One of the blessings of being in ministry for a long, long time is that I've been able to establish a great network of friends who are also serving churches, just like I am, literally all over the nation. And these are individuals, some have a lot of experience and some are really young and they're just beginning their service in ministry. And so one of the things we enjoy doing as a group is reading books together. I guess maybe that's a little nerdy, but that's something we enjoy, reading challenging books that will stretch us and help us to serve more effectively. So one of the books I'm reading right now is by John Mark Comer, entitled Live No Lies. Live No Lies. What a title. It's not a light read, but it's really good. And so a significant quote, here's what he says. When Jesus says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free," he was simultaneously saying that we are enslaved by lies. We are in bondage to the tyranny of false ideas about reality that hold our souls and our society in captivity to suffering and pain. Isn't that the truth? If you know the truth indeed will set you free. But simultaneously, what he's really saying is we have equal potential to be enslaved by lies. Lies about ourselves, lies about other people, lies about the very culture that we live in. As I read this quote, as some of my friends and I are reading this book by Comer, which again, it's a little bit of a stretch and it's a little bit of a heavy lift. One of the things that occurred to me, I thought of a quote that I heard from an experienced minister a number of years ago. I was in my early 20s, I just started my career. And in a speaking engagement, he made the comment, "The longer I've served in ministry, the longer that I have preached, I have realized the importance of spending more time reading the Bible than books about the Bible. Simply knowing the truth, and that the truth will set you free." We're going to do just that for the next several months. I'm going to be exploring the Gospel of Luke. The theme being a place for you, because Luke places so much emphasis in his gospel on unique people who had very distinct needs, more so than the other gospel writers. So we'll have a strong exposure to truth and have the ability to have truth about ourselves, about others, and about our relationship with God. So I'm going to do something a little interesting this morning as I introduce the Gospel of Luke. I had a plan. For this morning. How I was going to introduce Luke. I was going to talk about who Luke was written to. Luke was written to an individual by the name of Theophilus, so he would have certainty regarding the things that he had heard and been taught. That's in Luke chapter 1. And I was going to talk about the different themes in Luke. I had it all mapped out. And then early on this week, I completely scrapped that plan. And what caused me to scrap the plan is I've been trying to read ahead. I'm committed to reading Luke regularly, just on a personal basis, just reading it through. And as I was reading through, I was very convicted early on this past week. And I scrapped my plan and I thought, no, I want to introduce Luke in a very different way. Let me pause before I go any further. I want to encourage you to read along. We're going to spend approximately 6 months in Luke, so read along and reading Luke. So Luke has 24 chapters. So that means you could read a chapter a day and even take a few days off and have the Gospel of Luke read during Luke in its entirety during the course of a month. And if we did that for 6 months, you'd have the opportunity to read through Luke in its entirety 6 times. Now, that's one possibility. You may be one of those advanced placement students, and you may want to read 4 or 5 chapters a day. But here's my encouragement. Do whatever is helpful to you. Be as flexible as possible, and don't be overly rigid. So if you get up in the morning and you decide, I want to read 5 chapters, great, more power to you. But if you decide that particular morning, I'm just going to read a few verses in one particular chapter. I'm just going to read one chapter and really focus all of my energies just on a very small amount of material. That can actually be super helpful, and it may be a way actually to internalize what's being said in a better manner. So I just want to, let's read together. I encourage you to do that when we went through the Gospel of John this past year. And I can't tell you how many conversations I had with all of you about not necessarily a particular sermon, but about your reading experience. You shared those things with me, and those were wonderful dialogues. And I hope we can have similar experiences as we work through the Gospel of Luke. So when you read Luke, here's what's going to happen. You're going to meet some people the other gospel writers do not include in their accounts. And that's precisely where I was really convicted during the course of this past week. I thought, wouldn't it be helpful as we read together this first go-around? I'm thinking the first go-around, I'm just going to say somewhere between now and around the 1st of October. So we're looking at 6, 7 weeks, somewhere in that range for the next 6 or 7 weeks. As you read Luke, if you want to read 5 or 6 chapters a day, you're going to read 1 chapter a day. As you read through Luke, I want to encourage you to take special note of the people you are introduced to in Luke's gospel. Focus on the people. How did their interaction with Jesus change their life? How does your perception of them shape your faith? What is significant about being introduced to various individuals in Luke's gospel? Now, you may be so familiar with all these interchanges and stories in Luke's gospel. You're like, oh, this is old hat. I've known the parable of the prodigal son forever in Luke chapter 15. I'm fully acquainted with all the characters who are portrayed in that parable. It's nothing new. Well, again, let me encourage you to read with fresh eyes, as I've heard the phrase, do a naive reading of the text. But during this first go-around, about first maybe 7 weeks of this series, somewhere around the 1st of October, we'll come back and we'll decide, okay, we're going to read through Luke again, and I'm going to have a second assignment. I've already got what that second assignment is in mind, and I'll introduce that at the time. But for now, when you read Luke, meeting some people that the other gospel writers do not include in their accounts. So here's one. The widow at Nain. This story is unique to Luke's gospel. In Luke chapter 7, verses 11, 13, just a little portion of that story. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Let me pause there. In terms of Luke's writing style, one of the things that you're going to note quickly, he gives a lot of attention to interesting details. So in this case, he's giving attention to the fact that this person who died, this son, it was the only son of this woman, and also the fact that she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." He was filled with compassion for this woman. And in a Jewish funeral procession, it wouldn't be like a funeral procession here. They would come out and they would have professional mourners who would wail and were very loud and would draw a lot of attention. And so as they're exiting, Jesus and those who were accompanying him would quite naturally take notice of what was going on here. So being introduced to the widow at Nain, what do we learn about Jesus? And what do we learn about her? And how does this interchange that Jesus has, how does that shape you, and how does that speak to your heart? This is only just a teeny tiny portion of the whole story. There is a lot more, and I'll just leave that to your imagination if you're not familiar with this part of Luke. Then there's Mary and Martha. We're familiar with the story of Mary and Martha, at least some of you are, in Luke chapter 10. And before I read anything, isn't it true that if you're familiar with this story, Martha gets the bad rap? That is so, so unfortunate. I've been fortunate to be surrounded by Marthas all my life. And if I didn't have the Marthas in my life, I'm telling you, I would be in a whole lot of trouble. But the story of Mary and Martha, it's unique to Luke's gospel in this particular account. Verse 38 of chapter 10, as Jesus and disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. I already like her. She's a hospitable lady. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." And I'm just going to leave those two right there. Let you pick up the story as you read through Luke's gospel. But you'll be introduced to these two sisters. And as it turns out, these individuals are going to become very important in a personal way, not only to the ministry of Jesus, but in a personal manner in terms of his relationships. Then there was a man who was beaten and left for dead. Sometimes we refer to this text as the parable of the Good Samaritan, but I think it's better to call it what it really is. This is a man who was beaten and left for dead on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He didn't have a flat tire. This is a life and death situation. So Jesus tells this parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. He may have thought he was dead. And if he came in contact with a dead body, he would consider to be unclean and would not be able to participate in things that were taking place at the temple in Jerusalem. Same thing with the Levite. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and he saw him. He took pity on him. There's a lot more to this story as well. But you're going to be introduced in your reading of Luke to this person who was beaten and literally left for dead. How does this parable speak to your very heart as you think about the reactions of at least three different individuals? There's this priest, there's a Levite, and finally there is the Samaritan. How does that speak to your heart? Really spending some time in this section of Luke chapter 10 where Jesus tells this parable. And of course, there's some interesting interchange that prompts the telling of the parable in the first place, and that's also included in Luke chapter 10. Then there's the father who ran. One of three parables in Luke chapter 15. The father who ran. Good, proper Jewish men don't run. But the text says, but while he was still a long way off, referring to his younger son who had left and squandered his wealth in wild living. His father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. It's probably one of the most familiar parables in Scripture, and yet so rich in meaning. Speaks to us again at the very heart level. So as you read Luke this time, as you're looking at these various characters, there's Mary and Martha, and this man left for dead, and here's this father who ran. To really spend some time with the characters who are portrayed in this parable as well. Then I'm going to back up to Luke chapter 12. There was a person whom I'm going to characterize as a successful and greedy businessman. And so in verse 13 of chapter 12, someone in the crowd said to him, saying to Jesus, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Jesus replied, Man, who appointed me a judge and arbiter between you? Then he said to them, Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And he goes on and tells a parable. In verse 16, he told them this parable, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And so you'll be introduced to this person who's going to determine, as he had a bumper crop that year, what is he going to do? How is he going to react? And he's portrayed in the parable as being very greedy and experiencing the consequences of such greed. You'll be introduced to him. And then another widow. And interestingly enough, Luke has a special interest in terms of his gospel, a special interest in the women Jesus encountered, and a special interest in those who are especially vulnerable. So that would be true of the widow at Nain in Luke chapter 7, and it's again characteristic here in Luke chapter 18. It says, Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people went through. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't come eventually and attack me. So this vulnerable widow, and of course Jesus is telling this parable as a way of conveying the importance of being persistent in prayer, not giving up on the whole ideal of prayer itself. But we'll get to know this widow and to think about her position in life and to think about her position in reference to this unjust judge, as he is so referred. And then there's a guy who's an extortionist. Now, you're introduced to him as Zacchaeus, but the truth is he is an extortionist. Tax collecting in the Roman Empire was nothing short of extortion. And the story of Zacchaeus is a great story for Vacation Bible School. Here's this little short guy. He goes up in the tree to see Jesus, and it makes for a great Vacation Bible School story. But the truth is, he's an extortionist. And you're going to get acquainted with an extortionist when you get to Luke chapter 19 in your reading. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. He's up in a tree. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. So you'll have not only an appreciation for the character of Jesus, but you'll also have opportunity to reflect on people who reacted to Jesus, both positively and negatively as well. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possession to the poor. If I've cheated anybody anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. His encounter with Jesus was most definitely a life-transforming experience. Then there was an impoverished man named Lazarus, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine living and lived in luxury every day. At his gate laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. So the rich man in Lazarus, or the impoverished person named Lazarus, it's a convicting story, and again, a little bit of a repeat from Luke chapter 12, because it speaks to greed, it speaks to our priorities, it speaks to our very identity and who we are. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, that's not unique to Luke's gospel, because Mary's mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew as well. There's other references to Mary, but Luke really gives a lot of attention to Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the sense that the birth of Jesus and the circumstances surrounding his birth are told from the viewpoint of Mary. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, greetings, you are highly favored. The Lord is with you. And then finally, the disciples on the road to Emmaus. This is another story that is unique to Luke's gospel. Now, that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that happened, and they talked and discussed these things with each other, and Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. This is just a very brief, not necessarily exhaustive listing of people that Jesus encounters, people who are unique to Luke's account of the gospel of Jesus. So my encouragement again is, let's read. Let's read slowly. Let's read carefully. Let's allow the truth to set us free. And let's get thoroughly acquainted with real people who had encounters with Jesus. I'm going to refer to this as our first reading adventure in Luke. And again, somewhere around the 1st of October, I'll outline some purposes for our second reading adventure in Luke. But this is our first reading adventure in Luke. And bottom line is, how do the stories of these individuals shape your faith? These are real people, as you are real and you have real needs as well. The second reading adventure in Luke is yet to come. I'll leave you hanging on that one, October the 1st. Let's pause for a moment, and we're going to sing an invitation song. We'll have one of the shepherds will be up here with me, and you can respond accordingly. And also, at the very back to my right, we'll have a couple of shepherds and their wives who would eagerly welcome you and pray with you, maybe even just do some good listening and encouragement as well. Wasn't it meaningful to give away first-rate Bibles today? A group of all boys. Is that not exciting? So one of these days, Marlita is going to come to y'all and say, I need a teacher for the 3rd grade, and it's going to be this room full of boys. I can't wait. I think that's going to be fun. I could be that person who's asked, so I better be careful what I say. Let's sing our invitation this morning, acknowledging that we want to eagerly welcome you. Let's stand and sing.